Part 2. The Nature of Wealth. Chapter 5. Gropings Toward a Determination of Wealth. Yet such was the feeling that there ought to be a political economy, and so agreeable to the ruling class was what was offered as such, that chairs for the study of it began to multiply. And as nearly every professor of political economy thought it incumbent on him to write a textbook, or at least to do something to show a reason for his existence, there was much going over old ground and picking out small differences, but no questioning of anything that could arouse vital debate. And given a state of society in which the many were poor and the few were rich, any attempt to point out the true political economy, if it got attention, would inevitably arouse much debate. Thus, in fact, political economy, as it found teachers and professors and the standing of a science, was a very comfortable doctrine to the class who had appropriated land as belonging to them exclusively. It applied the doctrine of letting things alone, without any suggestion of the question of how things came to be. It was, as it was styled by Clement C. Biddle, the American translator of Say, the liberal doctrine that the most active, general, and profitable employments are given to the industry and commerce of every people by allowing to their direction and application the most perfect freedom compatible with the security of property. As to what constitutes property, there was no dispute, and if one did not look too closely, and beyond the usages of the times, in the more advanced European nations, there could be no dispute. Property? Why, property was, of course, what was susceptible of ownership. Any fool would know that. The question of the validity of property was never really raised in England until after the publication of Progress and Poverty began to call it up. But the attention which that has aroused has since brought to light some definite utterances, which show, as I take it, that the doctrines of the French physiocrats would have found hospitable reception in Great Britain had it been possible at the time to have really made them known. Thus, H.M. Hyndman has dug up from the British Museum a lecture by Thomas Spence, delivered before the Philosophical Society of Newcastle, a year prior to the publication of The Wealth of Nations, and for which the Society, as Spence puts it, did him the honor to expel him. In this lecture, Spence declares that all men have as equal and just a property in land as they have in liberty, air, or the light and heat of the sun, and he proposes that the value of land should be taken for all public expenses, and all other taxes of whatever kind and nature should be abolished. He draws a glowing picture of what humanity would be if this simple but most radical reform were adopted. But so much was he against the wishes of all that had authority, his proposal was utterly forgotten until dug out of its burial place more than a century after. So, in 1889, D.C. MacDonald, a single-tax man and the solicitor of Aberdeen, dug out of the Advocates' Library of Edinburgh and the British Museum in London copies of a book printed in 1782 by William Ogilvy, Professor of Humanities in King's College, Aberdeen, entitled An Essay on the Right of Property in Land, with respect to its foundation in the law of nature, its present establishment by the municipal laws of Europe, and the capital regulations by which it might be rendered more beneficial to the lower ranks of mankind. Professor Ogilvy, though he makes no reference to any other authority than that of Moses, had evidently some knowledge of the physiocrats, and most unquestionably declares that land is a birthright which every citizen still retains. He advocates the taxation of land, with the entire abolition of all other taxes, though, as if despairing of so radical a reform, he proposes some palliatives such as allotments to actual settlers, leases, etc. He doubtless saw the utter hopelessness of making the fight under existing conditions, for it seems probable that his book was never published, only a few copies being printed for private circulation by the author. Among the scholastically accepted writers in the first 30 years of the century are two who seem to have some glimmerings of the truth perceived by the physiocrats, of the relations between land and labor, though in a curiously distorted way. Dr. Chalmers, who was a divinity professor in the University of Edinburgh and a strong Malthusian, contended that the owners of land ultimately paid all taxes levied on labor, and contended that titles, which he regarded as so much retained by the state for beneficial purposes, should be maintained. All others he would have ultimately abolished, and the revenues of the state ultimately raised from the value of land. This, he thought, would be simpler and better, and avoid much dispute, relieving government from the odium of taxes which so endanger the cause of order and authority. He was a staunch supporter of primogeniture, opposed to anything which aimed at the division of the land, and would have the country enjoy the spectacle of the noble and splendid aristocracy. And while he would have the landlords pay all taxes, he thought it wholesome and befitting that they should have the political ascendancy also. For the lords of the soil, we repeat, are naturally and properly the lords of the ascendant. Another curious example of the perversion of the doctrine of the relation between land and labor was given by Edward Gibbon Wakefield, who visited this country in its more democratic days in the first quarter of the century. He was impressed with the differences between the society growing up here and that to which he had been used, and viewing everything from the standpoint of those accustomed to look on the rest of mankind as created for their benefit, he deemed the great social and economic disadvantage of the United States to be the scarcity of labor. How could an English gentleman emigrate to a country where he might actually have to black his own boots, and where no one could count on a constant supply of labor, ready to accept as a boon any opportunity to perform the most menial and degrading service? He saw, as Adam Smith before him saw, that this scarcity of labor came from the cheapness of land where the vast area of the public domain was open for settlement at nominal prices, without the slightest question that the land was made for landlords and that laborers were intended to furnish a supply of labor for the upper classes. He wished to bring about in these new countries such salutary scarcity of employment as would give cheap and abundant labor from the very start of settlement. He, therefore, proposed that land should not be given, but sold at the outset at what he called a sufficient price, a price high enough to make laborers work for others until they acquired the fund necessary to pay a price for what nature offered without money and without price. The money received by the state in this way he proposed to devote in paying the passage of suitable and selected immigrants. This plan was very attractive to the more wealthy and influential class of Englishmen concerned in, or thinking of, emigrating to the newer colonies, and was finally adopted by the corporation concerned in settling West Australia and afterwards the other Australian colonies. But even its obvious inferences never affected the teaching of political economy. In 1850, two works appeared in England which were both premonitions of the upcoming demand for a political economy that would take some consideration of the interests of the masses. One of these was by Herbert Spencer, then young and unknown, and was entitled Social Statics, or the Conditions Essential to Human Happiness Specified, and the first of them developed. Chapter 9 of this book, The Right to the Use of the Earth, is a telling denial of what the economists of Smith's school had quietly assumed could not be questioned: the validity of property in land. It got no attention in England. It was, however, reprinted in the United States in 1864, with a note by the author, and when, about 1877, Appleton and Company of New York became the American publishers of his philosophical writings, they reprinted this with his other works, and on the strength of them, it began to get into circulation. This was the only work of the kind I knew when writing Progress and Poverty. In A Perplexed Philosopher, 1892, I have given a full account of it, and of Mr. Spencer's shifting repudiation and final recantation of what he had said in denial of property in land. Some notion of the incongruity of the idea that a small fraction of mankind were intended to eat, and eat luxuriously without working, and another and far larger portion to have nothing but work to enable them to eat, and be compelled to beg as a boon the opportunity to do that, runs in broken flashes through much of the reform literature. But in political economy, as it up to 1880 existed, all such questioning was tabooed, and the utmost that could be found in any of the writers recognized by the schools was a timid suggestion that the future unearned increment of land values might sometime be recognized as belonging to the community, a proposition that, though it amounted to nothing whatever, as landlords were ready to sell land for what would give them any unearned increment not yet in sight, caused John Stuart Mill, who had been giving some adhesion to it, to be looked on askance by some as an awful radical. The struggle for the repeal of the Corn Laws in England did not lead to any development of a protectionist political economy. Books and pamphlets enough were written in favor of protection, but they were merely appeals to old habits of thought and vulgar prejudices, and the forces in favor of repeal carried them down. Elsewhere, however, it was different. On the continent, the conditions under which the tentative victory of free trade was won in England were lacking. Cut up into hostile nations, burdened with demands for revenue, the mercantile system got a practical hold that could not be broken by the half-hearted measures of its English opponents, and the claim of hope which came with the English-French treaty, negotiated between Cobden and Napoleon III, was destroyed by the tremendous struggles which followed the fall of the latter. In Germany, the outburst of national feeling which followed the struggles with France and the unification of German states gave rise to a school of German economists who taught a national economy in which, under various names, such as romantic, inductive, and national, protectionism was advocated. When it came to making peace between England and the United States after the War of Independence, the American commissioners were instructed to stipulate for complete free trade between the two countries. They failed in this owing to the prevalence of the protective sentiment in Great Britain at the time. When the Articles of Confederation gave way to the Constitution, the need for an independent source of revenue took the easy means of laying a federal tariff upon foreign productions, though free trade between the states was guaranteed, and the growth of selfish interests caused by and promotive of a constantly increasing demand for greater revenue built up a strong party in favor of protection, which had its way when the slavery question, taking sectional shape, put the states in which protectionism was dominant in control of the government with the secession of the South. This interest sought warrant in a scheme of political economy, and found it in drawing from the German economists and the writings of Henry C. Carey of Philadelphia. In America, this protectionist semblance of a political economy had its chief seat in the University of Pennsylvania, and the support of a powerful party in which the ideas of Jefferson were opposed by those of Hamilton. Among the schools, moreover, there was a divergence which began to assume greater proportions. As a success of the anti-corn laws, struggle began to be shown in the accomplishment of all that any of its advocates dared to propose. This took shape in a contention as to value, which inclined to emphasize the fact that the admission that somewhat immaterial things were conceded to be wealth destroyed the ability to keep any immaterial things having value out of that category, and consequently, that wealth in the common sense was the only thing to be considered in political economy, which was really a science of exchanges. With the efforts of Jevons, MacLeod, and others, this began to make way, and was naturally affiliated with the historical, the inductive, the socialistic, and other protectionist schools which grew from the continental teachings. Instead of working for greater directness and simplicity, it really made of political economy an occult science in which nothing was fixed, and the professors of which, claiming superior knowledge, could support whatever they chose to. During the century, another form of protectionism had been growing up, originating in England, but gaining adherents everywhere. Like the others, it recognized no difference between land and the products of labor, counting them all as wealth, and aimed at the improvement in the conditions of labor. Recognizing the workers as a class naturally separate from employers, it aimed to unite the laborers in combinations, and to invoke on their behalf the power of the state to impose restrictions, shortened hours, and, in various ways, to serve their interests at the expense of the primarily employing class. This took the form of what passed for a system in Karl Marx's ponderous 2 volumes entitled Capital, written in England in 1867, but published in German and not translated into English until after his death in 1887. Without distinguishing between natural opportunities and products of labor, Marx holds that there are 2 kinds of value, use value and exchange value, and that through some alchemy of buying and selling, the capitalist who hires men to turn material into products gets a larger value than he gives. Upon this economic proposition of Marx, political schemes with slight variations have been promulgated after the matter of political platforms. Under the name of socialism, a name which all such movements have now succeeded in appropriating, all such plans are embraced. We sometimes hear of scientific socialism as something to be established, as it were, by proclamation or by act of government. In this, there is a tendency to confuse the idea of science with something purely conventional or political, a scheme or proposal, not a science. For science, as previously explained, is concerned with natural laws, not with the proposals of man, with relations which always have existed and always must exist. Socialism takes no account of natural laws, neither seeking them nor striving to be governed by them. It is an art or conventional scheme like any other scheme in politics or government, while political economy is an exposition of certain invariable laws of human nature. The proposal which socialism makes is that the collectivity or state shall assume the management of all means of production, including land, capital, and man himself. Do away with all competition, and convert mankind into 2 classes: the directors, taking their orders from government and acting by governmental authority, and the workers, for whom everything shall be provided, including the directors themselves. Modern socialism is more destitute of any central and guiding principle than any philosophy I know of. It has no system of individual rights, whereby it can define the extent to which the individual is entitled to liberty or to which the state may go in restraining it. And so long as no individual has any principle of guidance, it is impossible that society itself should have any. How such a combination could be called a science, and how it should get a following, can be accounted for only by the fabled facility of writing without thinking, which the learned German ability of studying details without any leading principle permits to pass, and by the number of places which such a bureaucratic organization would provide. However, through government repression and its falling in with trade union notions, it has made great headway in Germany, and has taken considerable hold in England. Chapter 6. The Breakdown of Scholastic Political Economy. In January 1880, preceded in 1879 by an author's edition in San Francisco, appeared My Progress and Poverty, and it was later followed in the same year by an English edition and a German edition, and in 1882 by cheap paper editions both in England and the United States. Progress and Poverty has been the most successful economic work ever published. Its reasoning has never been successfully assailed, and on 3 continents it has given birth to movements whose practical success is only a question of time. Yet, though the scholastic political economy has been broken, it has not been, as I at the time anticipated, by some of its professors taking up what I had pointed out, but by a new and utterly incoherent political economy which has taken its place in the schools. Among the adherents of the scholastic political economy, who had been claiming it as a science, there had been, from the time of Smith, no attempt to determine what wealth was, no attempt to say what constituted property, and no attempt to make the laws of production or distribution correlate and agree, until there thus burst on them from a fresh man, without either the education or the sanction of the schools, on the remotest verge of civilization, a reconstruction of the science that began to make its way and command attention. What were their training and laborious study worth if it could be thus ignored, and if one who had never seen the inside of a college should be admitted to prove the inconsistency of what they had been teaching as a science? It was not to be thought of. And so, while a few of these professional economists, driven to say something about progress and poverty, resorted to misrepresentation, the majority preferred to rely upon their official positions in which they were secured by the interests of the dominant class, and to treat as beneath contempt a book circulating by thousands in the 3 great English-speaking countries and translated into all the important modern languages. Thus, the professors of political economy seemingly rejected the simple teachings of progress and poverty, refrained from meeting with disproof or argument what it had laid down, and treated it with contemptuous silence. Thus, the professors of political economy, having the sanction and support of the schools, preferred to unite their differences by giving up what had been insisted on as essential, and to teach an incomprehensible jargon, an occult science which required a great study of what had been written by numerous learned professors all over the world, and a knowledge of foreign languages. So the scholastic political economy, as it had been taught, utterly broke down, and, as taught in the schools, tended to protectionism and the Germans, and to the assumption that it was the recondite science on which no one not having the endorsement of the colleges was competent to speak. The new science speaks of the science of economics, and not of political economy. It teaches that there are no eternally valid natural laws, and, asked if free trade or protection be beneficial, or if the trusts be good or bad, declines to give a categorical answer, but replies that this can be decided only as to the particular time and place, and by a historical investigation of all that has been written about it. As such, inquiry must, of course, be left to professors and learned men. It leaves the professors of economics, who have almost universally taken the places founded for professors of political economy, to dictate as they please, without any semblance of embarrassing axioms or rules. Such inquiry as I have been able to make of the recently published works and writings of the authoritative professors of the science has convinced me that this change has been general, in all the colleges, both of England and the United States. So general is this scholastic utterance that it may now be said that the science of political economy, as founded by Adam Smith and taught authoritatively in 1880, has now been utterly abandoned, its teachings being referred to as the teachings of the classical school of political economy, now obsolete. What has succeeded is usually denominated the Austrian school, for no other reason that I can discover than that far kine have long horns. If it has any principles, I have been utterly unable to find them. The inquirer is usually referred to the incomprehensible works of Professor Alfred Marshall of Cambridge in England, whose first 764-page volume of his Principles of Economics, out in 1891, has not yet given place to a second, and to the ponderous works of Eugen Fürst-Böhm-Bawerk, professor of political economy, first at Innsbruck and then at Vienna. This pseudoscience is admirably calculated to serve the purpose of those powerful interests dominant in the colleges under our organization, that must fear a simple and understandable political economy, and who vaguely wish to have the poor boys who are subjected to it by their professors rendered incapable of thought on economic subjects. There is nothing that suggests so much what Schopenhauer, Parerga, and Paralipomena said of the works of the German philosopher Hegel than what the professors have written and the volumes for mutual admiration which they publish as serials.
If one should wish to make a bright young man so stupid as to become incapable of all real thinking, the best way would be to command to him a diligent study of these works. For these monstrous piecings together of words which really destroy and contradict one another, so causes the mind to vainly torment itself in the effort to discover their meaning, that at last it collapses, exhausted, with its capacity for thinking so completely destroyed that from that time on, meaningless phrases count with it for thoughts.
It is to this state that political economy in the teachings of the schools, which profess to know all about it, has now come. Chapter 7. Wealth and Value. We have seen the utter confusion that exists among economists as to the nature of wealth, and have sufficiently shown its causes and results. Let us return now to the question we have in hand, and that must first be settled before we can advance on solid ground. What is the meaning of wealth as an economic term? The only proposition as to wealth on which we may say that all economists agree is that wealth has value. But as to whether all that has value is wealth, or as to what forms of value are wealth and what are not, there is wide divergence. And if we consider the definitions that are given in accepted works, either of the term wealth or of the subterm of wealth, capital, it will be seen that the confusions as to the nature of wealth which they show seem to proceed from confusions as to the nature of value. The term value is of most fundamental importance in political economy, so much so that by some writers political economy has been styled at the science of values. Yet, in the consideration of the meaning and nature of value, we come at once into the very quicksand and fogland of economic discussion, a point which, from the time of Adam Smith, has been wrapped in increasing confusions and beset with endless controversy. Let us move carefully, for here is a point from which apparently slight divergences may ultimately distort conclusions as to matters of the utmost practical moment. The original and widest meaning of the word value is that of worth or worthiness, which involves and expresses the idea of esteem or regard. But we esteem some things for their own qualities or for uses to which they may be directly put, while we esteem other things for what they will bring in exchange. We do not distinguish the kind or reason of regard in our use of the word esteem, nor yet is there any need of doing so in our common use of the word value. The sense in which the word value is used is for common purposes sufficiently indicated by the conditions or nature of the thing to which value is attributed. Thus, the one word value has in common English speech two distinct senses. One is that of usefulness or utility, as when we speak of the value of the ocean to man, the value of the compass in navigation, or the value of the stethoscope in the diagnosis of disease. The other, and though derived, utterly distinct sense of the word value is that of what is described as exchangeability or purchasing power, as when we speak of the value of gold as greater than that of iron, of a book in rigid binding as being more valuable than the same book in plain binding, of the value of a copyright or a patent, or of the lessening in the value of steel by the Bessemer process. The first sense of the word value, which is that of usefulness, the quality that a thing may have of ministering directly to human needs, was distinguished by Adam Smith as value in use. The second sense of the word value, which is that of worth in transfer or trade, the quality that a thing may have of ministering indirectly to human desire through its exchangeability for other things, was distinguished by Adam Smith as value in exchange. These two terms, adopted by Adam Smith as best expressing the two distinct senses of the word value, at once took their place in the accepted economic terminology. But though the terms of distinction which he used have been from the first accepted, this has not been the case with the distinction itself. From the first, his successors and commentators began to question its validity, declaring that nothing could have exchange value for which there was not demand. That demand implied some kind of utility or usefulness, and hence that what has value in exchange must also have value in use. And that Smith had been led into confusion by a disposition to import moral distinctions into a science that knows nothing of moral distinctions. The capacity of satisfying some desire, no matter how idle, vicious, or cruel, is indeed all that is necessary to exchangeability or value in exchange. But to give usefulness or value in use, something more is necessary, and that is the capacity to satisfy not any possible desire, but those desires at which we call needs or wants, and which, lying lower in the order of desires, are felt by all men. Value in use and value in exchange may and often do attach to the same things. As a matter of fact, doubtless the great majority of things having value in exchange have also value in use. But this connection is not necessary, and the two qualities have no relation whatever to each other. A thing may have use value in the highest degree, yet very little exchange value or none at all. A thing may have exchange value in very high degree and little or no use value. Air has the highest value in use, as without air we could not live a minute. But this supreme utility does not give air exchange value. The Bambino of Rome or the Holy Coat of Trevis could probably be exchanged, as similar venerated objects have been at times exchanged for enormous sums. But the use value of the one is that of a waxen doll baby, that of the other an old rag. The two qualities of value in use and value in exchange are as essentially different and unreliable as are weight and color, though as we sometimes speak of heavy browns and light blues, so do we in common speech use the word value now to express one of these qualities and now the other. The quality of value in use is an intrinsic or inherent quality attaching to the thing itself and giving it fitness to satisfy man's needs. It cannot have value in use except it has that, and as it has that, no matter what, be its value in exchange. And its use value is the same whether much can be obtained for it in exchange or no one would pick it up. The quality of value in exchange, on the other hand, is not intrinsic or inherent. There is, to be sure, a special sense in which, conformably to usage, we may speak in certain cases of an intrinsic value. The cases in which we do this are cases in which we wish to distinguish between the exchange value which a thing may have in a higher and more valuable form, and the exchange value which still remains if it were reduced to a lower or less valuable form. Thus, a silver pitcher or a United States silver coin would lose exchange value if beaten into ingots, yet they would retain the exchange value of the metal from which they were made. This value in exchange, which would remain in a lower form, we are accustomed to speak of as intrinsic value. But in using this term, we should always remember its merely relative sense. Value in the economic sense, or value in exchange, can never really be intrinsic. It refers not to any property of the thing itself, but to an estimate that is placed on it by man, to the toil and trouble that man will undergo to acquire possession of it, or the amount of other things costing toil and trouble that they will give for it. Nor is there any common measure in the human mind between usefulness and exchangeability. Whether we most esteem a thing for the intrinsic qualities that give it usefulness, or for its intrinsic quality of commanding other things in exchange, depends upon conditions. A daring fellow recently crossed from the coast of Norway to the United States in a 16-foot boat. Supposing him to come to New York, and one of our 100-fold millionaires, in the fashion of an Arabian Nights sultan, to say to him, "If you will make a trip at my direction, You may fill up your boat at my expense with anything you choose to take from New York, regardless of its cost. What would he fill it up with? That could not be answered in a word, as it would entirely depend upon where the millionaire wanted him to go. If he were merely to cross the Hudson River from New York to Jersey City, he would disregard value in use and fill up with what had the highest value in exchange in comparison to bulk and weight: gold, diamonds, paper money. To carry the more of these, he would leave out everything having value in use that he could get along without for an hour or two, even to extra sails, anchor, sea drag, compass, a morsel of food or drink of water. But if he were to cross the Atlantic again, his first care would be for things useful in the management of his boat and the maintenance of his own life and comfort during the long months of danger and solitude before he could hope again to reach land. He would regard value in use, disregarding value in exchange. If he had not lost the prudence, which, no less than daring, is required successfully to make such a trip, it may well be doubted whether he would not prefer to carry its weight in fresh water than to take a single diamond or gold piece and prefer another can of biscuit or condensed beef to the last bundle of $1,000 notes that he might take instead. Adam Smith was right. The distinction between value in use and value in exchange is an essential one. Despite all attempts to confuse and obliterate them, value in use and value in exchange must still hold their place in economic terminology. The terms themselves are perhaps not the happiest that might be chosen, but so long have they now been used that it would be difficult to substitute anything in their place. It is only necessary to do what Adam Smith could hardly have deemed necessary: point out what they really mean. They were taken indeed by him from common speech, and still retain the great advantage to any economic term of being generally intelligible. In common speech, the one-word value, as I have already said, usually suffices to express either value in use or value in exchange. For which sense of the word is meant is ordinarily indicated with sufficient clearness by the context. In cases where the indication is not sufficiently clear, the use of the word value will at once provoke a question equivalent to, "Do you mean value for use or value for exchange?" In economic reasoning, however, the danger of using one word to represent two distinct and often contrasted ideas is very much greater than in common speech, and if the word is to be retained, one of its senses must be abandoned. Of the two meanings of the word value, the first, that of value in use, is not called for, or called for only incidentally in political economy, while the second, that of value in exchange, is called for continually, for this is the value with which political economy deals. To economize the use of words, while at the same time avoiding the liability to misunderstanding and confusion, it is expedient, therefore, to restrict the use of the word value, as an economic term, to the meaning of value in exchange, as was done by Adam Smith, and has since his time generally been followed, and to discard the use of the single word value in the sense of value in use, substituting for it where there is occasion to express the idea of value in use, and the close context does not clearly show the limitation of meaning, either the term value in use or some such word as usefulness or utility. This I shall endeavor to do in this work, using hereafter the single term value, as meaning purchasing power or value in exchange. Chapter 8. Economic value, its real meaning and final measure. Value, as an economic term, means, as we have seen, value in exchange or exchangeability. But from what does this quality of value in exchange proceed, and by what may we measure it? Qualities such as size, distance, direction, color, and the like are only comprehensible and intelligible to us by reference to some fixed starting point. Size and distance, for instance, are comprehended and intelligibly expressed as relations to certain measures of extension, such as the foot, the meter, diameters of the Earth, or diameters of the Earth's orbit, or color as a relation to the order in which certain impressions are received through the human eye, and so on. Now, has not also the idea of value some fixed starting point by which it becomes comprehensible and intelligible, as have all other ideas of relation? Clearly, it has. What the idea of value really springs from is the relation of each thing having value to something which is the source and natural measure of all value, namely human exertion, with its attendant irksomeness or weariness. Adam Smith saw this, though he may not have consistently held to it, as was the case with some other things he clearly saw for a moment, as through a rift in clouds, which afterwards closed up again. In The Wealth of Nations, he says,
"Every man is rich or poor according to the degree in which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. But after the division of labor has once thoroughly taken place, it is but a very small part of these with which a man's own labor can supply him. The far greater part of them he must derive from the labor of other people, and he must be rich or poor according to the quantity of that labor which he can command or which he can afford to purchase. The value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities." Book 1, Chapter 5.
He repeats this statement a little further on.
Equal quantities of labor at all times and places may be said to be of equal value to the laborer, in his ordinary state of health, strength, and spirits. In the ordinary degree of his skill and dexterity, he must always lay down the same portion of his ease, his liberty, and his happiness. The price which he pays must always be the same, whatever may be the quantity of goods which he receives in return for it. Of these, indeed, it may sometimes purchase a greater and sometimes a smaller quantity, but it is their value which varies, not that of the labor which purchases them. At all times and places, that is dear which it is difficult to come at, or which it costs much labor to acquire, and that cheap which is to be had easily or with very little labor. Labor, therefore, never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. It is their real price. Money is their nominal price only. Labor, therefore, it appears evidently, is the only universal, as well as the only accurate measure of value, or the only standard by which we can compare the values of different commodities at all times and at all places.
How then is it that Adam Smith, when he needed a term which should express the second sense of the word value, did not adopt a phrase that would bring out the fundamental meaning of value in this sense, such, for instance, as value in toil, or value in exertion, or value in labor? But instead of any of them chose a phrase, value in exchange, which refers directly to only a secondary and derivative meaning? The reasons he himself gives, in what immediately follows the first two paragraphs I have quoted.
But though labor be the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities, it is not that by which their value is commonly estimated. It is often difficult to ascertain the proportion between two different quantities of labor. The time spent in two different sorts of work will not always alone determine this proportion. The different degrees of hardship endured and of ingenuity exercised must likewise be taken into account. There may be more labor in an hour's hard work than in 2 hours' easy business, or in an hour's application to a trade which cost 10 years' labor to learn, than in a month's industry at an ordinary and obvious employment. But it is not easy to find any accurate measure either of hardship or ingenuity. In exchanging, indeed, the different productions of different sorts of labor for one another, some allowance is commonly made for both. It is adjusted, however, not by any accurate measure, but by the higgling and bargaining of the market, according to that sort of rough equality which, though not exact, is yet sufficient for carrying on the business of common life.
There are here two reasons assigned for the choice of the term value in exchange, to denote what Smith saw with perfect, though only momentary clearness, really to mean value in exertion. The first, and it is a weighty one, is that the term value in exchange was already familiar, and would be best understood in bringing out the distinction he wished to dwell upon: the difference between value in the economic sense and value in use. The second, which indicates a confusion in the philosopher's own mind, the swiftness with which the clouds drifted over the star he had just seen, is that he could think of nothing by which to measure the toil and trouble of exertion except time of application, which he truly saw could only measure quantity and not quality. That is to say, duration, not intensity. He failed to recognize the obvious fact that if the toil and trouble of exertion dispensed with be the measure of value, then, correlatively, value must be the real measure of the toil and trouble of that exertion, and that the something he was seemingly looking for, some material thing or attribute which, as a yardstick measures length, should measure the toil and trouble of exertion, is not to be found, because it cannot exist, the only possibility of such a measurement lying in the higgling of the market. For since toil and trouble, which constitute the resistance to exertion, are subjective feelings which cannot be objectively recognized until brought, through their influence upon action, into the objective field, there is no way of measuring them except by the inducement that will tempt men to undergo them in exertion, which can be determined only by competition or the higgling of the market. Adam Smith was never called upon to revise or in any way to reconsider the statement of his great book as to the nature of value, the discussion on the subject having arisen since his death. His successors in political economy have been, with few exceptions, not men of original thought, but the mere imitators, compilers, and straw splitters who usually follow a great work of genius. They have, without looking further, accepted the term used by him, value in exchange, not merely in the same way that he accepted it, as a convenient, because a readily understood name for a quality, but as expressing the nature of that quality. Thus, Adam Smith's explanation of the essential relation of value to the exertion of labor has been virtually, if not utterly, ignored. These succeeding economists have been dissuaded and debarred not only by certain facts not understood, such as the fact that many things having value do not originate in labor, and by erroneous conceptions, such as that which treats labor itself as a commodity, but by a greatly effective recognition of the fact that danger to existing social institutions would follow any too searching an inquiry into the fundamental principle of value. A world of ingenuity has been expended, and monstrous books have been written that it will tire a man to read, and almost make him doubt his own sanity to try to understand, to solve the problem of the fundamental nature of value in exchange. Yet they have resulted in what are but ponderous elaborations of confusion, for the good and sufficient reason that the essence or foundation of what we call value in exchange does not lie in exchangeability at all, but in something from which exchangeability springs: the toil and trouble attendant upon exertion. The prevailing theory has been that value is really nothing more than exchangeability. The ingenious and elaborate attempts that have been made to give something like a solid support and logical coherence to this theory have only more clearly shown its utter inadequacy. The latest and most elaborate of these attempts, that of the Austrian or psychological school, is an attempt to emulate in economic reasoning the stories told of East Indian jugglers who, throwing a ball of thread into the air, pull up by it a stouter thread, then a rope, and finally a ladder, on which they ascend until out of sight, and then come down again. For whoever will work his way through the perplexities of their reasoning will find that the adherents of this school derive the value of pig iron, for instance, or even of iron ore in the vein, from the willingness of consumers to pay for higher and more elaborate products, into the production of which iron enters, deriving that willingness from a mental estimate on the part of consumers of the utility of those products to them. Thus, as coolly as such stories of Indian jugglers ignore the law of gravitation, do they ignore that law which to political economy is what gravitation is to physics, the law that men seek to satisfy their desires with the least exertion, a law from which proceeds the universal fact that as a matter of exchanging, no one will pay more for anything than he is obliged to. These elaborate attempts to link value to utility and the utility to individual will or perception in order to find support for the idea of value only show that there is no resting place in the supposition that value proceeds from exchangeability and can only be relative to other values. The plausibility of this supposition comes from confusion in the use of a simple word: exchangeability and value. Above all words in common use in the English tongue, the word thing is the widest. It includes whatever may be an object of thought, an atom or a universe, a fact or fancy. But this comprehensiveness of the word we are sometimes apt to forget or not fully to keep in mind, and to use such phrases as all things or anything when we really have in mind only things of one particular kind. When we wish to test the proposition that value is a relation of exchangeability between valuable things, we usually proceed to make a mental experiment with some few valuable things, for it would be impossible to take them all, and tiresome to attempt it. Thus, for instance, we think of money, or as the most widely known representative of money, a piece of gold, and say to ourselves, "Here is a piece of gold." Why is it valuable? It is that it can be exchanged for wheat, hardware, cotton goods, and other valuable things. If it could not be so exchanged, it would have no value, and the measure of its value is the value of the wheat, hardware, cotton goods, and other valuable things for which it is exchangeable. If the relation of exchangeability alters so that for that same piece of gold one can obtain more valuable things, the value of the gold rises, and that of the other valuable things falls. Then we reverse the standpoint of examination, taking in turn wheat, hardware, or cotton goods as representative of a particular instance of value, and gold as representing other valuable things, and seeing that their value depends upon their exchangeable relation in the same way as that of gold in our first experiment, we conclude that value is indeed a relation of exchangeability, and that is the beginning and end of it. Thus, that value depends on value, and springs from value, and can only be measured by value, seems to us perfectly clear, and we accept the doctrine that there can be no general increase or decrease in values, as if it were but another statement of the axiom that a whole is equal to the sum of its parts, and consequently that all those parts can never be increased or diminished at the same time. The habitual use of money as a common measure of value is apt to prevent any realization of the fact that we are reasoning in a circle. I think I have correctly described the line of reasoning which makes the derivation of value from exchangeability so plausible. I do not, of course, mean to say that labor is never taken into account. It is often expressly mentioned and always implied to be one of the valuable things in the category of valuable or exchangeable things. But the weight of the examination is, I think, always thrown upon such things as I have named. things resulting from the exertion of labor, while labor itself is passed over lightly as one of the other valuable things, and attention never rests upon it. And, furthermore, I am inclined to think that there always lurks in this examination, which is in reality an examination of the relative value of products of labor, the tacit assumption that the quantity of the valuable things, thought of as products of labor, existing at the specific moment presumed in the examination, is a fixed quantity, so that there can be no exchange between those possessed of valuable things, i.e., products of labor, and those possessed of no valuable things, i.e., no products of labor. This, I think, is the case even where the value of labor is given a place in the category of considered values, for what the reputed economists since Smith have called the value of labor is in reality the value of the products of labor paid to laborers in wages, which has been usually assumed to come from a fixed quantity, the capital existing at that moment. And on another side, any rigorous examination of the nature of value has been prevented by the universal disposition of economists to slur over the nature of the value of land, and practically to assume, what was indeed the common assumption, that it had the same origin as the value attaching to such things as gold, wheat, hardware, cotton goods, or similar products of labor. That it takes two to make an exchange is clear, but that value in one person's hands does not, as is taught in economic works, necessarily involve the existence of value in the hands of others, may be seen by another imaginative experiment. Let us imagine some remote and as yet undiscovered island, where men still live as in the biblical account our first parents lived before the fall, taking their food from never-failing trees, quenching their thirst from ample and convenient springs, sleeping in the balmy air, without thought of clothing. The power of exerting labor they would of course possess, but of that exertion in itself and of the toil it involves, we may imagine them as ignorant as Adam and Eve in their first estate are supposed to have been. On that island there would clearly be no value. Yet if valuable articles were brought there, would they necessarily lose their value? Could they be parted with only by gift? And would there be no possibility of exchanging them? Imagine now a ship containing such merchandise as would tempt the fancy of a primitive people to come in sight of the island and cast anchor. Would exchange between the ship's people and the islanders be impossible because of the lack on the part of the islanders of anything having value? By no means. If nothing else would suffice, the offer of bright cloths and looking-glasses would surely tempt the Eves, if not the Adams, and though never exerted before, the islanders would exert their power of labor to fill the ship with fruit or nuts or shells, or whatever else of the natural products of the island their exertion could procure, or to pull her on the beach so that she might be caulked, or to fill and roll her water casks. There was nothing of value on the island before the ship came, yet the exchanges that would thus take place would be the giving of value in return for value. For on the part of the islanders, value that did not exist before would be brought into existence by the conversion of their labor power through exertion into wealth or services. Even if we suppose the islanders to relapse into their former easy way of living when their visitors sailed off, there would still remain on the island, where there was no value before, some things having value, and this value would attach to these things until they were destroyed, or so long as there remained such desire as would prompt any of the islanders to render labor in exchange for them. On the other side, the value that the ship would carry off would certainly be not less than the value she contained on arrival, and in all probability would be much more. Now, the way thus illustrated is the way in which the value that attaches to the greater number of valuable things originates. I do not mean it merely to say that this was the way of the first appearance of value among men, but that it is the way in which the value that attaches to what are properly articles of wealth now originates, I do not mean merely to say, as Adam Smith said, that it was by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased. I mean to say that it is by labor that it is now purchased. Nothing, indeed, can be clearer than this. Even in the richest of civilized countries, the great body of the people in any civilized society consist of what we call the working class, who live almost literally from hand to mouth, and who have in their possession at any one time little, or practically nothing, of value. Yet they are the purchasers of the great body of articles of value. Where does the value which they thus exchange for value which is already in concrete form come from? Is it not from the conversion of their labor power, through exertion, into value? In common phrase, they exchange their labor for commodities. How does this fact, the fact that the great body of valuable things pass into the hands of those who have no value to give for them, except as they make valuable what before had no value, and are consumed by being eaten, drunk, burned up, or worn out by them, consort with the theory that value is a relation of exchangeability between valuable things, and that there can be no general increase or decrease of values? Does it not utterly invalidate the theory? Must there not be a constant increase of value to make up for the constant destruction of value, and in spite of it, to permit such growth of aggregate values as we see going on in progressive countries? And in times when the ability to convert labor into values is checked by what we call want of employment, and great numbers of workers are idle, is there not a clear lessening of the sum of values, a general decrease in values, as compared with the times when there is what we call abundance of employment, and the great majority of them are at work, turning labor power through exertion into value? The truth is that current theories of value have resulted from the effort of intelligent men to mold into a semblance of coherence teachings built upon fundamental incoherencies. Let me point out what gives them plausibility: the fallacy involved in the inclusion of labor as another valuable thing, while the real stress of the examination is laid upon the relative values of such things as gold, wheat, hardware, and cotton goods, things that are products of labor. It is a fallacy which our habit of speaking of the buying and selling and exchanging of labor, and our habit of thinking of the value of labor as we think of the value of gold or wheat or hardware or cotton goods, conceals from attention, but which is in reality a fallacy of the kind named by the old logicians the fallacy of undistributed middle. Here we come to another instance of the care needed in political economy in the use of words. By the word labor, we sometimes mean the power of laboring, as when we speak of the exertion of labor, or of labor being employed, or of labor being idle or wasting. Sometimes we mean the act of laboring, as when we speak of the irksomeness or toil of labor. Sometimes we mean the results of laboring, as is the case in most or all of the instances in which we speak of buying, selling, or exchanging labor. The real thing bought, sold, or exchanged being the results of laboring, that is to say, wealth or services. And sometimes, again, we mean the persons who do labor, or the persons who have the power and the willingness to labor. It is clear that labor in the first mentioned sense of the word, that of the power or ability of laboring, is not an exchangeable thing and cannot come into any category of values. It resides in the individual body and cannot be taken out of that body and transferred to another, any more than can sight or hearing, or wisdom or courage or skill. I may avail myself of another's skill, courage, or wisdom, of his hearing or of his sight, by getting him to exert them for my benefit. And so I may avail myself of another's ability to labor by getting him to do the services, or to produce things which I am to own. But the power of laboring he cannot give, nor can I receive. While there are results of its expenditure that may be transferred, the power in itself is intransferable, and therefore unexchangeable. Now, The failure to keep in mind these different senses of the word labor operates to shut off inquiry as to whether the cause of value is not to be found in labor. For since, in some senses, labor is thought of as having value in exchange, the term, without distinction as to its various senses, is apt to pass in our minds into the category of exchangeable things, with gold or wheat or hardware or cotton goods, and thus the question is unconsciously begged. But when we realize that when we say that labor is a valuable thing, we must carefully exclude the sense of labor power or ability to labor, a confusion is cleared up which has made the search for the true nature of what we call value, in exchange a fruitless swinging round a circle. For since value does not exist in labor power, but does appear where that power takes tangible form through exertion, the fundamental relation of value must be a relation to exertion. But a relation to an exertion in what sense? A relation to exertion positively, or a relation to exertion negatively? I exchange gold for silver, let us say. In this, I give something positively and receive something positively. I get rid of gold and acquire silver. The other party to the exchange gets rid of silver and acquires gold. But when I exchange gold for exertion or toil, do I get rid of gold and acquire toil? And does he get rid of toil and acquire gold? Clearly not. No one wants exertion or toil. All of us want to get rid of it. It is not exertion in a positive sense which is the object of exchange, but exertion in a negative sense, not exertion given or imposed, but exertion avoided or saved. Value, in short, is equivalent to the saving of exertion or toil. And the value of anything is the amount of toil which the possession of that thing will save the possessor, or enable him, to use Adam Smith's phrase, to impose upon other people through exchange. Thus, it is not exchangeability that gives value, but value that gives exchangeability. For since it is only by exertion that human desires can be satisfied, whatever will dispense its owner from the toil and trouble of exertion in the satisfaction of desire that acquires exchangeability. Let me put the proposition in another form. The current theory is that it is when and because a thing becomes exchangeable that it becomes valuable. My contention is that the truth is just the reverse of this, and it is when and because a thing becomes valuable that it becomes exchangeable. It is not the toil and trouble which a thing has cost that gives it value. It may have cost much, and yet be worth nothing. It may have cost nothing, and yet be worth much. It is the toil and trouble that others are now willing, directly or indirectly, to relieve the owner of in exchange for the thing by giving him the advantage of the results of exertion, while dispensing him of the toil and trouble that are necessary accompaniments of exertion. Whether I have obtained a diamond, for instance, by years of hard toil, or by merely stooping to pick it up, a movement which can hardly be called an exertion, since it is in itself but a gratification of curiosity which does not involve irksomeness, has nothing whatever to do with its value. That depends upon the amount of toil and trouble that others will undergo for my benefit in exchange for it, or what amounts to the same thing, which they will dispense me of in the satisfaction of my desire by giving me things in exchange for which others will undergo toil and trouble. Desire itself, which is the prompter to exertion, cannot be measured. It is a quantity which, being in its nature subjective, can have no objective measurement until it passes through action into the field of objective existence. But desire impels to action as what we call energy or force impels to movement. And while we can no more measure desire in itself than we can measure force in itself, we can measure it in the same way that we measure energy or force, by the resistance it will overcome. Now, while the resistance to movement is inertia, So the resistance to the gratification of desire is the toil and trouble of exertion. It is this that is expressed by and measured in value. Normally, value and exchangeability are thus always associated and seemingly identical. But in the causal relationship, value comes first. Exchanging is, in fact, the mutual transfer of value. Of all the qualities of things, value is the only quality of which exchange takes note. Value in exchange, or value in the economic sense, is worth in exertion. It is a quality attaching to the ownership of things, of dispensing with the exertion necessary to secure the satisfaction of desire by inducing others to take it. Things are valuable in proportion to the amount of exertion which they will command in exchange, and will exchange with each other in that proportion. The value of a thing in any given time and place is the largest amount of exertion that anyone will render in exchange for it. But as men always seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion, this is the lowest amount for which a similar thing can otherwise be obtained. This, of course, is not to say that whatever anything may exchange for it is its value. In individual and especially in unaccustomed transactions, the point at which any particular exchange takes place may considerably vary, but that our idea of value assumes a normal point, and what this point really is may be seen in common speech. Thus, we frequently say of the exchange of a certain thing that it brought less than its value, or that it brought more than its value. We say that a thing was exchanged at less than its value because someone else would have given more for it. And so what we deem the point of real value, or actual equivalence, we speak of as market value, from the old idea of the market or meeting place of those who wish to make exchanges, where competition or the higgling both the market brings out of the highest bidding or the lowest offering in transactions of exchange. And when we wish to ascertain the exact value of the thing we offer at auction or in some other way, we subject it to competitive offers. Thus, I am justified in saying that the value of a thing in any time and place is the largest amount of exertion that anyone will render in exchange for it, or to make the estimate from the other side, that it is the smallest amount of exertion for which anyone will part with it in exchange.